Okay, welcome to Lesson 4, the February Revolution. This is a big day, big moment.
It's an emotional day.
As you heard from that unfamiliar voice to my right, I'm now joined by Mr. Suter of the History Department. Mr. Suter, welcome.
Thank you very much.
We're here to talk to you guys today about the February Revolution and provide some insight into how Russia and the Tsar fell from power.
So, just as a quick recap to Russian society, it is an inherently unfair society with a vast majority, around 90% of the population, who are the poorest 90%, basically held up economically, socially, politically, the rest of the system. The working class in the cities and the peasantry in the countryside were largely oppressed and exploited by everyone up the chain. And what World War I does, as we will see, and as hopefully we've already covered, is make that tension and anger, which is already there by 1914, worse by 1918.
So just to recap, Russia ends up in World War I in 1914, fighting against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, mostly today making up, of course, the countries of Austria and Hungary, surprise, surprise, but also against the Germans. We know that the situation was tense before. There had been problems in Russia ever since the 1905 revolution. And a lot of these problems weren't made better by anybody in the intervening years, despite the efforts of Stolypin and other people like that. Nevertheless, the leadership of the Tsar was definitely under question, and when he takes over leadership of the army, it's still under question, including the fact that they didn't win. Moreover, economic weakness meant that the Russian army was poorly equipped. They had lousy guns, poor army infrastructure. They couldn't get supplies to the front as the trains and the rail lines were inefficient and too slow. Also, too, there was a lot of social tension in the Russian army. The officer class, the commanders, were seen as wasting men's lives. These were the rich people, of course, ordering the poor people to go and fight and die for them. And as a sense, as losses entered into the millions in some cases, things got worse and worse and worse.
Finally, there are political tensions as well, which just get worse and worse. People didn't like the Tsar as he was, but the combination of a mad rapist monk, a German wife who the rumours were that was a spy, the fact that the Tsar, by putting himself as the head of the army, also made himself blameable for all the problems that happened, and the fact that people just generally saw how corrupt and inefficient, that means pretty much useless, the system had become. So at every stage of this, what World War I does not create new problems. Russia was always economically weak, always had social tension, and always had political tension, but it just makes it worse. Because now, Russians are being killed in droves, and poor Russians are being killed in droves, because of this terrible system. And so when we look at the events that caused the February Revolution, it's important to remember that the events that caused it is just a spark. This is an exact picture from the London riots. Hopefully you're well enough to just about remember the London riots. Essentially, yes, there was an incident, there was a shooting, which then the riots followed, but the problems and the reasons the riots happened were long before, and all the shooting was for something that kicks it off. And it's the exact same story for the February Revolution. A small thing gets out of hand, there's a shooting, and it all kicks off. We can't say that shooting caused the February Revolution. It was these long-term social, economic and political problems that we've already looked at from the start of this course.
Okay, so what happened in February 1917? As mentioned in the last lesson, the winter of 1916-1917 was probably one of the coldest on record, with average temperatures hovering around minus 30 degrees Celsius. Not to mention the fact that people were starving, huge food shortages caused by the economic inefficiencies that we talked about contributed to a general discontent amongst the people. I mean, it's not hard to figure out if you're starving, you're probably not happy. Couple all of this, of course, with the fact that there's horrible news from the front lines. And 1916, things go enormously badly for the Russian army. Not to mention the fact that the Russian army itself is being led by the Tsar, but the situation in the front is absolutely terrible. In fact, the Russians will lose in the second half of 1916 and early 1917 over 1 million men fighting to protect Russian territory from the advancing Austrians and Germans. Of course, all of this leads to things like bread rationing, and when this is introduced in February 1917, it causes marches in the city of Petrograd. Now, Petrograd is one of, and you'll have to get used to this, I suppose, is a city that has many names. The workers call it Petrograd. The Tsar calls it St. Petersburg, and afterwards it would be called Leningrad, renamed for the hero of the October Revolution, which we haven't talked about yet. Anyways, bread rationing, introduced in early February, leads to marches in Petrograd, with members from across the class system actually protesting and demanding to be fed. This, of course, very quickly becomes a political situation, and it leads to people openly questioning the Tsar. I think most notably, you look at the Grand Duke Michael. Grand Duke Michael is an aristocrat, and when you get to a point when even the aristocrats, the people who are closest linked to the royal family, are openly questioning the Tsar, then you get to a point when you can start to understand how the whole system is going to collapse in and on itself. If you recall back to 1905, one of the major reasons the Tsar was able to keep control is he could rely on the army. But unlike in any major other protest where the Tsar could always count on the army to fire on the protesters and keep order, the local army garrison in the city actually joins the protesters. And by the 26th of February, the spark is lit, and the police, desperately trying to hold on to the situation, actually fire on the crowd. And Mr. Suter talked a moment ago about a shooting. Well, this is a shooting that they're talking about. On the 26th of February, in light of all of this hardship and anger, when the police fire on the crowds, the people aren't willing to take it any longer.
What turns this from a badly handled riot? There have been plenty of protests before this point, but they'd always been put down by the Cossacks and the policemen. The Cossacks being the loyal soldiers to the Tsar. What changes into a revolution is that the army, en masse in the local area, who are, according to rumours, were going to be sent to the front, almost to certain death at any point, they turn and join the masses. They kill their officers, they kill the local police officers, usually throwing them from the buildings to the crowds below. In the violence that follows, 1,500 people, mostly representatives of the Tsar and his government, are killed, and this whole situation is out of control by the 28th of February. It is clear the Tsar does not have control, and this destroys his authority. The Tsar, remember, up until this point, had been kept in line by fear and by the fact that people thought his regime could never be removed, and now that is proven wrong. And instead, people look towards the Duma being the parliament that got made after 1905 for leadership, and people start hoping that the men of these Duma will form the basis of a new parliament, a parliamentary democracy to run the country into the Tsar. At the same time, though, the socialists are also planning their own government. As you've mentioned before, the socialists are looking towards a different world, a world without parliaments, without elections, which is capitalists, more towards where the workers run their own affairs. And as you'll see, they start forming something called Soviets, which are basically committees, councils of workers who vote for a representative of their own worker. For example, if the JFS had a Soviet, all the teachers might have a vote and send 2 teachers to the local Kingsbury Soviet or local London Soviet, to say our voice.
It would like to be you and I, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the heroes of JFS. The army saw this situation and realised that it's out of control. And they told the Tsar they could not support him. That would be too problematic and it would cause a civil war that they would ultimately lose. So the Tsar, realising he had nowhere to go, abdicates. That means leave the throne on the 2nd of March 1917.
Before we move on, it's an interesting side note to understand is that the Tsar was really sort of ignorant to the severity of the situation at home. In fact, the Tsar believes that he can just get on his train and head back to Petrograd, sort things out. But that train is in fact stopped outside of Petrograd by the soldiers, who inform him, I guess, very frankly, that his services were effectively no longer needed. And the Tsar, from that point, it basically abdicates his throne, and then the Russian government enters a period of transition.
So, the Provisional Government is what comes into power after the Tsar. We can't just have nothing happen, so the men of the Duma form this Provisional Government. Provisional means temporary. It's a government no one's voted in. They're just people from the Duma who will run the country until there's proper democratic elections in November. Okay, these being men of the Duma, they are not socialists. Socialists would not be invited to Duma. They are middle class, democratic, liberal capitalists. Okay, they represent the middle class. However, There are very few middle-class people in Britain, Russia even. And so there's no natural basis for it. The vast majority of Russians are poor peasants or poor workers. And now we've got this government, which as we'll see is a massive problem, who only represents a small group. And most Russians look at and don't see a great deal of difference between them and the Tsarist regime. Both are richer than them, both think they're better than them, both of which do want a political system that doesn't help. Okay, so the new government, although is put into power and is accepted, this is not going to last a long time. Well, as we'll see, it's going to be further undermined by what the socialists do next.
So as Mr. Suter just said, the working class, the socialists, start to form into organizations which they give themselves the title of Soviet. It's basically means a union. The Soviets will create Soviets of factories and army units, and these little committees, as was said, would vote on a number of people who'd go and meet in a larger Soviet. Now, the larger Soviet was known as the Petrograd Soviet, and amongst the working class, the overwhelming majority of the people of Russia and the overwhelming majority of the people in Petrograd, they believed that the Soviet was the legitimate power, that they had the moral authority to rule Russia and the abdication of the Tsar, in spite of the Provisional Government. When you look at the picture,
as you can see, compared to the last picture, which is men in suits, middle-class men in suits, these are all workers. These are soldiers. There's a lot of military unions here. There's red banners in the background. This is an entirely different thing to the quiet middle-class men of the parliament, of the provisional government. These are angry, these are socialist, these are workers, very often poorly educated, but very high on passion.
And I suppose one of the important parts is in the wake of the Tsar's abdication, and the fact that the army had basically mutinied and gone over to the side of the Petrograd Soviet, as many of these people are also armed.
Absolutely right, and as we'll see, with Soviet Order Number 1, the first thing that the Petrograd Soviet proclaims, that is made even stronger. So on the 1st of March, their first order orders that soldiers should only listen to orders from the provisional government if the Petrograd Soviet agreed. So say if the provisional government says, soldiers, go and arrest those socialists we don't like. If the provisional government, if the Petrograd Soviet says, no, there are socialists, leave them alone, the soldiers would have to listen to the Petrograd Soviet. If the provisional government says, go and attack those Germans over there, if the Petrograd Soviet didn't want to send its soldiers over there, then they would say no. This shows that the power was made to lie with the Soviet as they controlled the army. If you control the army, to quote Mao Zedong, for people who control the guns, control the power. If you can shoot people to make them do what you want, you have the power to threaten and make people believe what you want. And this is really key from day one. And what gives the Soviets the power to make this order and make people listen to it is that the vast majority of soldiers are poor workers and poor peasants who are forced into the army. They will naturally listen to the Soviet, so they will naturally listen to Soviet Order Number 1. If by some miracle the army is made up of middle-class people all the way through, then obviously they were more likely to listen to the provisional government, but that's not the case. And so Soviet Order Number 1 from day one shows that, yes, we've got provisional governments, but the power lies, as we'll see next, in the hands of the Soviet. So this is a good example, the Toroy Palace, where the provisional government and Petrograd Soviet sat. The provisional government was technically in charge of the country, with them sitting on the left-hand side of the Toroy Palace and on the right-hand side the Petrograd Soviet. And what we see in this weird situation where the Petrograd Soviet have some power, the provisional government have some power, is actually the provisional government are in charge of the country, but the people with the actual power are the Petrograd Soviet. So, for example, the provisional government, they were told their job was to run the country, but they only had support from the middle classes. They were made to deal with all the big controversial issues about peace, about bread, and about land. And so when people were unhappy about the war, they got the blame. On the other hand, the Petrograd Soviets, avoided being directly in charge. No one could blame it for doing any decisions the government made. But if the provisional government did any law they didn't like, for example, let's go to war, let's go to invade this place, or let's get rid of these socialists, they would block it. Because they also controlled the army and they had to support the masses, they had all the power. So we've got this weird situation, it's worth dwelling on, that the provisional governments, they are the face of the Russian government. They make the decisions, they run the country, and they get the blame. But actually, they've got a responsibility. But when you look at it, the power lies at Petrograd Soviet. Yes, they're not making the decision. They're just sat at the back. They're like arms and legs. They have the strength. They have the power. They can make or break decisions. Okay, so the Petrograd Soviet have the power, but no responsibility. So all what happens is the provisional government gets more and more unpopular, and the Petrograd Soviet sits back and just blames the provisional government as well.
It's really important to keep that in mind, that for the next few months between February and October 1917, we have a position, as Mr. Suter said, where we have a government in power that's completely thoroughly undermined, and the significance of Soviet Order Number 1 cannot be underestimated, and this is something you guys really need to know. So overall, where are we? Now, first, the Tsar falls because of World War I. Okay, it made the long-term problems in Russia much, much worse. So historians generally conclude that Russia would have eventually got rid of the Tsar, but World War I basically accelerated the process, and by February 1917, the Tsar was gone. The February Revolution ends up bringing the middle class in the provisional government to power, but don't forget that this provisional government's power was sort of elusive because it had to deal with the socialist Petrograd Soviet, and it would undermine its power and authority at many different cases, and in effect be the real power brokers in Russia, even though they, in fact, didn't have their name on the building, for lack of a better term. This situation with the Petrograd Soviet running the country, behind the scenes, and the provisional government running the country, at least on paper, could not last. Eventually there would be a confrontation between the middle classes in the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet to determine who actually had the power in Russia. Full stop. And that's all we have for this lesson. We look forward to seeing you guys in Lesson 5. I'd like to thank Mr. Suter for joining me, and we wish you all the best. From Mr. Raine,
and Mr. Suter, have a good one.
Yep.